She sat quietly in the last row of the courtroom, saying nothing, just observing. But the moment the judge saw the small silver cross around her neck, he pounded his gavel and fined her $500 for wearing a necklace. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the motivation that drives us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Karoline adjusted the collar of her blazer as she stepped through the courthouse doors. The building was modest, almost forgettable, nestled between a shuttered diner and a hardware store with peeling paint. The air inside smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper, the kind of scent that clung to spaces that hadn't changed in decades. She wasn't here to make headlines. Just observe, listen, report back. As the White House press secretary, she was used to crowded press rooms and carefully worded statements. But today wasn't about cameras or speeches. It was supposed to be a simple assignment: monitor a routine hearing in a small town court. The kind of grassroots engagement her office occasionally encouraged. She sat in the last row, quiet, polite. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. Clerks shuffling papers, a bailiff glancing occasionally at the clock. Her suit was simple, navy blue, her notepad resting neatly on her lap. Around her neck, she wore a thin silver chain with a small cross, barely noticeable, resting just beneath the collarbone. A gift from her mother, one of the few things she had left of her. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. An older man, maybe in his late 60s. He walked with the kind of confidence that didn't require words. His eyes scanned the room, indifferent at first, until they landed on Karoline. He paused. "Miss, would you please remove that necklace?" he asked. Not loudly, but with a tone that silenced the rustling papers around them. Karoline looked up, puzzled. "I'm sorry, Your Honor? The cross. It's a religious symbol. We do not allow any display of faith during court proceedings," he said, tapping the desk lightly with his gavel. "I'm not testifying," she replied, her voice calm. "I'm just observing. This necklace, it belonged to my mother." "You're in a courtroom," the judge replied. "Rules apply to everyone. Remove it, or I'll issue a penalty." For a moment, no one moved. The clerks looked down. A man sitting 2 rows ahead shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. One woman near the aisle looked at Karoline, then quickly away. Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue, but she didn't remove the necklace either. Instead, she folded her hands neatly over her notepad. The gavel hit wood. $500, the judge announced. Contempt of court. The room didn't gasp. There were no dramatic whispers. Just a suffocating stillness. The kind of silence that didn't come from respect, but from fear. Karoline blinked once, then reached into her purse and slowly pulled out her phone. With a soft click, she began recording. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. "This isn't about a necklace," she said to herself. No one looked directly at her, but the energy in the room had shifted. A tension that hadn't been there before. Because Karoline knew what the judge didn't. She wasn't just someone who spoke at press briefings or smiled behind a podium. Long before politics, she had studied law. Before the White House, there was Harvard. And before all that, there was a promise made to her mother. Never let silence become permission. She didn't say anything else that day. But she didn't have to. As she stood to leave the courtroom, her phone still recording, Karoline felt the weight of something larger settle on her shoulders. This wasn't going to end with a $500 fine. This had just begun. Noi Dung Chuang 1. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than it should have. Karoline leaned against the beige painted wall, her phone still recording, the screen dimly glowing in her hand. People walked past her, court staff, lawyers, even a young man in a hoodie who gave her a confused glance before hurrying along. No one said a word. She had questions, real ones. So she approached the court clerk's desk with a steady voice. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her tone even. "Can you point me to the written rule that prohibits wearing a small cross in court?" The clerk didn't even look up. He flipped through a folder, stapled a paper, then moved on to the next task as if she weren't there. She asked again, this time more firmly. He finally looked at her. "Ma'am, I can't comment on courtroom protocol. You'll have to take it up with the judge," he muttered, then walked away without another word. Karoline stepped back, trying to hold onto her composure. A female staff member nearby, maybe in her late 20s, gave her a quick sympathetic look and took a step forward, as if about to say something. But before a word left her mouth, another clerk brushed past and gave her a look that said, "Don't." The younger woman turned away, silent. Karoline returned to the courtroom just as the judge was finishing up with another case. Without looking directly at her, he raised his voice to the room. This courtroom observes its own standards. Any symbol or attire that may provoke, distract, or compromise neutrality is subject to restriction. There was no mention of her name, no direct reference, but everyone knew who he meant. A man in the second row, gray hair, flannel shirt, hard eyes, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered just loud enough to carry. "Who does she think she is? Showing up here like she owns the law?" A few quiet chuckles followed. No one objected. Karoline turned and walked toward the exit. She didn't rush, didn't look back, but the weight pressing against her spine felt heavier with every step. It wasn't just what had happened, it was how easily the room had agreed with it. Outside, the air hit her like a slap. The fall wind was sharp, tugging at the edge of her coat. She stood beneath the flagpole where the stars and stripes flapped against a dull gray sky. Her hand instinctively went to the cross around her neck. She opened her phone. The recording was still going. She replayed the last minute of audio, listening closely. The judge's words, though vague, carried an unmistakable tone, one of command, not legality. A hint of disdain lingered in the way he said, "Standards." She clicked save, then dialed her office. "Dispatch." A young voice answered. "This is Karoline," she said. "I need to report an incident at the county courthouse in Larchwood." There was a pause. Then, "Understood. Should I patch you through to the legal team?" "No, just mark it for now," she said, "but I want it on record. I was penalized for wearing a cross." The judge cited a non-existent policy. Another pause. Then a polite reply, carefully worded. "Ma'am, we recommend addressing this quietly. These small-town judges can be sensitive. It might be best not to escalate. Optics, you know." Karoline didn't respond right away. She looked up at the flag again, her breath slow and visible in the chilly air. "I'll take that into consideration," she said, then ended the call. Her phone buzzed with an incoming email, but she ignored it. The courthouse door swung open behind her with a hollow creak. She didn't turn. "I saw what happened," a voice said, calm but firm. She turned slightly, just enough to see the man approaching. Middle-aged, worn leather jacket, notepad tucked under his arm. A press badge hung from his neck. "You're not the first," he said, "but you're the first to push back." Karoline met his gaze. "Are you with the paper?" "Local news." He nodded. "Name's Marvin. I've been covering this courthouse for a while. That judge has made a few things disappear over the years. Fines, citations, people." She studied him, trying to read whether he meant it as hyperbole. But there was no smirk, no irony, just a quiet anger. Marvin continued. "They always back down. They pay the fine, shake it off, and leave. You didn't." Karoline didn't answer. She just looked down at her phone. The screen now dark, but still warm in her hand. He took a step closer. "If you're planning to let this go, I understand, but if you're not," he reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded business card. "You're gonna need someone who knows where the cracks are." She took it, slid it into her pocket. Behind her, the courthouse doors creaked again, then closed. She looked up at the sky, clouds rolling in fast, the air thick with something unsaid. Because deep down, she knew, this wasn't about jewelry, or courtroom decorum, or even a single judge. It was about who got to decide what dignity looked like, and who didn't. Marvin's office wasn't much, just a cramped space above the bakery, with faded blinds and the faint smell of old ink and coffee grounds. Karoline sat across from him, notebook open, as the local reporter leaned back in his creaky chair, arms crossed over his chest. "You're not the first, you know," he said, his voice calm but laced with something colder underneath. "People here, they've been fined for hats, shirts, pins, anything that stands out, but no one ever pushes back." Karoline jotted a few notes, her eyes never leaving his. "Any records?" Marvin snorted. Some. Most got buried or tossed. But there were complaints filed, couple years ago. A teenager got slapped with a contempt charge for wearing a Pride wristband. His mother raised hell for a week. Then she stopped. Why? Lost her job at the post office the next month. Budget cuts, they said. Karoline's pen paused. She didn't need a legal degree to recognize the pattern. She'd seen this before, in other forms. Under other flags. But here, it was quieter, slower, harder to prove. She thanked Marvin and walked over to the county records office. It was open to the public, barely staffed, barely maintained. After 2 hours of digging, she'd found 7 formal complaints over the past 4 years, all citing judicial bias or procedural mishandling. All dismissed. The language was always the same. Insufficient evidence, no grounds for investigation, internal discretion. She copied each one and tucked them neatly into her folder. Later that afternoon, she sat in her rental car with a lukewarm coffee, staring at her phone. The screen showed a contact name, Mrs. Eileen Hutchins. Karoline hesitated, then tapped call. The voice on the other end was tired, wary. I don't want to talk about it, the woman said after Karoline introduced herself. I understand, Karoline replied gently. You don't have to go on the record. I just want to know what happened. There was silence, then a sigh. I wore a shirt, the woman said, just a cotton tee with a verse from Psalms. I was there for a parking ticket. And the judge fined you? $500. Said it was inflammatory. I tried to explain, but he told me to sit down and stop wasting the court's time. Karoline waited. I got letters afterward, Mrs. Hutchins continued, about code violations on my property. My landlord said he was pressured to increase rent. I didn't fight it. I just moved. Karoline thanked her and hung up. That night, back in her hotel room, she spread the documents across the bed, the dismissed complaints, the scribbled notes, the voice memo she'd saved from Mrs. Hutchins. The pattern was clear. People who spoke differently, dressed differently, prayed differently. They were the ones being silenced. She drafted an email to a civil rights watchdog group based in Chicago. She explained what she'd seen, what she'd found, what she suspected. The reply came the next morning. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We will review, but we'll need more direct evidence before pursuing legal action. She read the response 3 times. Then she looked out the window. The courthouse was just a block away, its flag barely moving in the still air. She returned to her laptop and checked her inbox again. There it was, an email from an address she didn't recognize. No name, no message, just a single audio file attached. She hesitated, then hit play. Voices filled her room, muted at first, then growing clearer. It was a recording of a staff meeting inside the courthouse. Karoline heard the judge's voice. Unmistakable. This town needs order, he said. We're not here to coddle protesters or babysit out-of-towners. I want clean proceedings. Anyone who walks in here with some message hanging around their neck or plastered across their chest, deal with it. Hard and fast. A pause. Then he added, they don't follow my standards. They don't belong in my courtroom. The recording clicked off. Karoline sat still, her mind racing. It wasn't just the tone. It wasn't just the arrogance. It was the fact that no one in that room had pushed back. She replayed the file twice, then saved it to a secure drive. Outside, the sun was setting behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the square. People were still walking by that building every day, unaware of what echoed behind those walls. Karoline looked at her phone, finger hovering over the contact list. This time, she wasn't calling to ask for permission. She was calling to prepare for a fight. Karoline sat in the video conference room at the White House media wing. The soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead doing nothing to ease the tension settling in her chest. On the screen were 5 faces, communications directors, policy liaisons, and 1 deputy chief of staff. She had requested the meeting to explain what had happened in Larchwood. She expected some concern, maybe even support. She didn't expect silence. Well, she finished, carefully placing her notes down. That's the sequence of events. And I have audio recordings backing it up. One of the men on the screen adjusted his tie, then leaned toward his webcam. We appreciate the update, Karoline, he said in that clipped, bureaucratic tone she had heard too many times. But perhaps this isn't something we need to elevate further. Excuse me? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Another face jumped in, Susan. Someone Karoline had once looked up to. Karoline, we know your instincts are good. But small-town politics are like old tree roots. You pull too hard. You bring up the whole yard. I'm not trying to bring up a yard. Karoline replied. I'm trying to stop a man who believes he can define justice however he wants. In America, in a courtroom, the deputy chief leaned forward again. Let's not make this about you. Karoline, you've got national responsibilities. Don't get pulled into something that could cost us goodwill with state leaders. Her screen froze momentarily, then resumed, just in time for her to hear what stung the most. Let it go. After the meeting ended, she sat still for a moment, her laptop lid half closed, the hum of the room growing louder in the absence of conversation. Let it go. It repeated in her head like a drumbeat, from the people she worked beside, from those who'd once praised her fire and integrity, from those who now wanted her quiet. A few hours later, Marvin forwarded her a clip from the local news broadcast. She opened it hesitantly. The judge stood at a podium in front of a courthouse seal, looking every bit the respectable figure of justice. His voice, however, was anything but measured. It is unfortunate, he said, when outsiders come into our community and seek to disrupt the dignity of our courts. This is not Washington. We don't perform justice for cameras. We uphold it. He paused for dramatic effect. And when individuals, even those in government, challenge that, there are consequences. The next morning, the Larchwood Herald ran a front-page headline. White House official disrupts courtroom proceedings, DA reviewing potential charges. Karoline read it 3 times before closing the tab. She knew how quickly stories twisted once they left your hands. In the hotel lobby, Marvin caught up with her again. His usual sharpness was dulled today. You're playing a long game, he said, but this town doesn't play fair. You need to think hard about whether it's worth staying in. She didn't answer. Her phone buzzed with another email. Unknown sender. No subject line. She hesitated, then opened it. The message was simple. I used to work for him. I know what he's done. I have recordings. Attached was a single audio file. She waited until she was alone in her room before pressing play. It started mid-sentence, scratchy and muffled at first, then clear. If they step out of line, I don't care what statute they quote. I don't need law books. I don't need some outsider lecturing me. In this courtroom, I am the law. Click. That was it. No grand confession. No yelling. Just calm, certain tyranny. Karoline stared at her screen. Not because she was shocked, but because somewhere in the back of her mind, she already knew this wasn't just about a fine or a cross or a courtroom. It was about a man who had been allowed to decide who mattered, and who didn't, for far too long. And now, his words weren't just bouncing off courtroom walls. They were in her hands. The sun was barely rising when Karoline slipped into the booth at the old diner on the edge of town. She ordered coffee, black, and waited. 10 minutes later, Naomi walked in, tall, quiet, with her hair tied back and her eyes darting nervously around the room. They didn't hug, just a brief nod before Naomi slid into the seat across from her. I almost didn't come, Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, Karoline replied, sliding a napkin aside, but you did. That matters. Naomi looked down, hands clasped tight. I worked for him for 5 years. I kept my head down. I watched people cry in hallways, walk out shaking. Once, a woman collapsed after being fined $500 for wearing a turban. He said it was a distraction. I said nothing. Karoline waited, letting the silence make room for more. I started saving things, emails, recordings. I didn't plan to, but after he threatened that veteran last year for asking to read a statement, I couldn't just erase it. From her coat pocket, Naomi pulled out a flash drive and slid it across the table. I copied everything I could. Internal memos, audio from staff meetings. I even have one of him laughing about a disabled kid who couldn't speak up in court. Karoline didn't touch the drive. Not yet. Naomi, she said softly, if I go public with this without legal coverage, they could turn it on both of us. Harassment, privacy invasion. They'll spin this every way they can. I know, Naomi said, But if you don't say it, no one ever will. Later that afternoon, Karoline sat alone in her hotel room with a civil rights attorney on speaker. He didn't give her his name, just credentials and calm, measured language. There's precedent to protect whistleblower material, he said, but if you expose it prematurely, before building a clear case or gaining media traction, they can sue you for slander, breach, or even security interference. She glanced at the drive again. What would you do? She asked. I'd wait for the right moment. Make it strategic. Let the outrage build in waves, not bursts, and have a public hearing where no one can shut the door. The call ended, but the static lingered in her mind. By the next morning, the judge made his move. A formal letter from the district office was delivered to her hotel. The language was stiff and cold. Cease and desist. Any public statement regarding court conduct would be considered interference. Potential legal consequences. Marvin called an hour later, his voice low. They're floating your name through every local paper now, saying you're trying to dismantle the independence of small-town courts. Then came a message from someone inside the White House communications office, someone she used to eat lunch with every Thursday. You should know. The message read, they're talking about pulling you off the press team. They want distance from this. Karoline stared at the screen. Pulled off. Silenced. She stood at the window, watching trucks roll through the quiet street. Life below moved as if none of it mattered. But it did. It mattered because no one else had the leverage she did, and yet, every inch of the system was pressing her to stay quiet. That afternoon, she made her choice. She took the cleanest, clearest clip from Naomi's recordings, a moment where the judge, mid-meeting, said, some of these people don't even know what respect means. If they don't follow, break 'em down. Who's going to stop me? She sent it to a reporter at the Washington Ledger, one she'd worked with before. Someone she trusted not to sensationalize. Then she drafted a simple post. Holding power means respecting the people you serve. What happens when that power goes unchecked? Tomorrow, I'll speak plainly, on my own terms. She clicked send. The town square had a gazebo near the courthouse. She booked it under her own name and filed a notice of a public statement to be made at noon the next day. She didn't know who would come. But for once, she wasn't speaking as a staffer, a strategist, or a loyal voice to an administration. She was speaking as Karoline, as someone who had been told to sit down and decided not to. The morning before the hearing, Karoline opened her inbox and knew something was off. There were over 100 new messages, most with subject lines like, shame on you, or playing the religion card again. She refreshed the page. More kept coming. Then came the texts. Turn on channel 7. You're all over social media. They're coming after you. She grabbed the remote and flipped through the channels until she landed on a local broadcast. The news anchor, with that practiced neutrality, was reading a statement. The Honorable Judge Raymond Ellison has issued a response regarding recent allegations made by a federal official. He states the official is exploiting her position and personal beliefs to stir unnecessary division in the community. The screen cut to a clip, Karoline, mid-sentence at a protest months earlier, arguing passionately about civil rights. But the footage was clipped, her voice raised, her gestures sharp, the context completely gone. This is why the courts must remain neutral, the anchor added, before cutting to another guest who spoke about how dangerous it is when federal officials step into local matters they don't understand. Karoline sat frozen. Her phone rang, but she didn't answer. Another news channel, another opinion piece. By noon, hashtags with her name were trending. The comments were split like a torn flag. Some called her a hero. Others called her a fraud. Even Marvin stopped responding. The same man who had handed her stories of people mistreated now avoided her calls. She received a summons to the Office of Communications at the White House. The conversation wasn't long. You're putting the administration in a difficult position, the director said, not unkindly, but with the weariness of someone managing too many fires at once. Karoline didn't interrupt. She didn't have the energy. If you continue, he added, we'll have no choice but to suspend you indefinitely. No defense, no discussion, just a final warning. That evening, her apartment felt colder than usual. The television played to no one. The coffee she poured sat untouched. She stared at the corkboard covered in notes, emails, and timelines. Everything she had built now buried under doubt. She thought of her mother then. The tiny silver cross still hung around her neck. Karoline touched it out of habit, then closed her eyes and leaned back. Maybe this wasn't her battle. Maybe the storm was bigger than her name could weather. Her laptop sat open across the room. On impulse, she reached over, found the master audio file Naomi had given her, and hit play. She had listened to it a dozen times before. But this time, a different voice spoke up, near the end of the meeting. Quiet, almost dismissive. Just file it the usual way. The voice said, redact what you need. No one reads the originals anyway. She sat up straight. She rewound. Played it again. Redact what you need. No one reads the originals anyway. Her hands trembled slightly as she paused the audio. That voice belonged to a court clerk, someone still working under Judge Ellison. The implication was clear. They'd been altering records, not just abusing power, but falsifying legal documentation. That wasn't just a scandal. That was a crime. Karoline's heart pounded as she opened her email. She didn't hesitate this time. She attached the full audio file, along with all supporting evidence, dates, names, transcripts, and sent it directly to Senator Judith Remmer's office. Senator Remmer was a veteran of civil rights battles. Sharp, principled, and not afraid of pushback. Karoline had seen her from a distance at briefings. Respected her from afar. She typed the subject line carefully. Request for review. Misconduct and falsification of court records, urgent. Underneath, she wrote, I am writing not as a White House official, but as a citizen. I believe this material points to serious violations within the local judicial system. I am prepared to speak under oath. Then, finally, she leaned back in her chair. The wind outside rattled the windows. Cars passed on the street like nothing had changed. But something had. The silence she'd been drowning in was broken by the truth she had always carried. Now finally out in the open. And tomorrow, she would stand before a crowd that might not believe her. But this time, she wouldn't be alone. Karoline sat alone in the quiet of her apartment when the email arrived. The subject line read, Senator Remmer, immediate response. She opened it with cautious fingers, her pulse climbing. Inside, it was brief but clear. We've reviewed your submission. All materials have been forwarded to the Executive Oversight Committee. A hearing has been requested. Stand by. She leaned back slowly, letting the message settle. It had taken weeks of gathering scraps, moments of doubt and silence, the sting of being alone even among colleagues, but now, finally, something was moving. Just 2 hours later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. Columnist Franklin Adler publishes piece on White House staffers' courtroom clash. The headline was longer than usual, dramatic but thoughtful. A small cross and a larger truth inside the courtroom. Adler's words weren't harsh. In fact, they carried a kind of clarity Karoline hadn't expected. He outlined the legal precedent, the constitutional lines Judge Ellison may have crossed, and the troubling trend of local courts operating in unchecked isolation. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who ever sat quietly in a courtroom and left feeling smaller than when they entered. By that evening, the media floodgates opened. National networks picked up the story. Panels debated it. Op-eds popped up across the internet, some in praise, others dripping with cynicism. Some labeled Karoline a hero. Others called her an attention seeker hiding behind a cross. She stayed off the television. She didn't open Twitter. Instead, she focused on the upcoming hearing, which would be held not in a courtroom, but at the City Hall, a neutral ground, though still heavy with tension. The morning of the hearing, the line wrapped around the block. Cameras flashed. Protesters held signs both in her defense and in loud opposition. Some shouted about the First Amendment. Others waved posters that read, "Faith doesn't belong in court." Inside, the chamber was tight with bodies and heat. Karoline walked in slowly, shoulders steady, eyes forward. Senator Remmer sat near the front with members of the Oversight Committee. Their expressions unreadable. When called, Karoline stepped forward. Her hands didn't shake. I am here not as a government employee, she began, but as a citizen who believes the Constitution should apply to all of us, equally. Without exception, she laid out what happened that day. Word by word, no dramatics, just facts. Then she pulled a folded sheet from her pocket and began reading from the First Amendment. No law shall be made respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Wearing a small cross, she continued, silently, in a courtroom, is not an act of aggression. It is an act of memory, of identity. And in my case, grief. The room was silent. Next came Naomi. She walked slowly to the microphone, cleared her throat, and confirmed what she had witnessed while working under Judge Ellison: threats, pressure, record tampering, fear disguised as procedure. A second witness followed, a man in his 60s, calm but firm, described how he'd been fined for refusing to remove a cultural pendant that his family had worn for generations. The judge called it distracting. He said, "But I wasn't even talking. I was just sitting there." By the end of the testimonies, the atmosphere had shifted. Some of the press looked shaken. Others scribbled rapidly. A legal advisor for the state judiciary made a brief statement, attempting to frame the judge's actions as misguided, but within judicial discretion. But it rang hollow. Finally, one of the committee members stood. "We cannot ignore what's been shared here today," he said. "We are initiating a formal investigation. Effective immediately, Judge Ellison will be placed on temporary administrative leave pending the outcome." It wasn't everything, but it was something. Outside the hall, the crowd had grown louder. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the marble steps. Karoline emerged into the open air, surrounded by flashes and murmurs. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she expected a headline or message of support. But it was neither. It was a text. No name. Just a number she didn't recognize. "You have no idea who you just challenged. This isn't over." She stood still for a moment, reading it again. Then she slid the phone into her bag, adjusted the strap across her shoulder, and walked down the steps, not fast, not afraid, but with the quiet weight of someone who had just cracked open a door others had long kept shut. The morning after the hearing, Karoline opened her apartment door to find a folded piece of paper wedged beneath the welcome mat. No envelope, no signature, just 4 words scribbled in block letters. "Keep your mouth shut." She read it once, then again. Her fingers tightened around the note before she crumpled it and dropped it into the trash. But the unease lingered. Over the following days, messages arrived in stranger ways. Emails from masked accounts with vague threats. Social media posts twisting her words. Headlines from fringe outlets accusing her of undermining the legal system. One claimed she was a plant by an anti-American group. Another labeled her a threat to judicial integrity. At night, when she walked home, she sometimes felt a presence behind her. Nothing concrete, but enough to make her check twice over her shoulder. Despite the pressure, the tide of public awareness continued to rise. The Senate Oversight Committee had formally requested a federal inquiry. The Justice Department confirmed that an internal review of Judge Ellison's conduct had begun. Even the Chief Justice of the state's Supreme Court issued a rare public statement: "No official is above scrutiny." And yet, the price was rising too. The White House called her in for a quiet meeting. "No press. No records. We're temporarily relieving you of duty," a senior staffer told her. "This isn't punishment. It's about ensuring neutrality while the courts handle the matter." Karoline gave a slow nod. She wasn't surprised. "You're sidelining me to protect the optics," she said calmly. He didn't argue. Word of her removal leaked within hours. But instead of fading, the story took a new turn. Marvin, the reporter who had gone silent, published a new piece. It opened with an apology. "I hesitated when it mattered. I won't again." He recounted internal memos he had received from courthouse staff years ago, alleging misconduct and bias, but none of his editors would run the story back then. Now, with Karoline's case in full view, the dots connected. He went public. Others followed. A former legal communications director shared that she'd been asked to massage transcripts from court hearings that might raise questions. A retired clerk gave a phone interview confirming she had seen Judge Ellison destroy letters of complaint unopened. Then came the march. It began as a Facebook event, a small gathering meant to show support. But it grew fast. Hundreds stood outside the courthouse steps, holding signs that read, "Justice isn't a private property," and "Rights don't stop at the door." The crowd was diverse: older couples, students, veterans, ministers. Some held small crosses, others held nothing at all. The message was clear: this wasn't just about a necklace. It was about fairness, visibility, and the danger of unchecked authority. That evening, Karoline appeared on a live broadcast with a major network. The host, respectful but direct, asked what kept her going. "I'm not doing this for recognition," she said. "I'm doing it because too many people have been told their voice doesn't matter inside those walls. I'm just the one who didn't stay quiet." It wasn't rehearsed, it was raw, and it spread. That same night, Karoline received a call from the governor's office. A special emergency session had been scheduled to review state judicial guidelines, particularly around courtroom dress codes, discretional fines, and transparency in minor courts. She was invited to speak as a primary witness. She stared at the phone after the call ended. Her reflection caught faintly in the black screen. It had started with a quiet insult, one small moment of humiliation. But now, it had grown into something louder, something harder to bury. The resistance hadn't ended, but now, neither had she. The chamber was packed beyond expectation. Not with press, not with politicians, but with people. Real people: teachers, retirees, churchgoers, store clerks. Some stood against the back wall. Others clutched manila folders to their chests, nervously watching the front where Karoline sat beneath the sharp white glow of the overhead lights. The chairwoman of the committee tapped her gavel once. "Ms. Karoline Hughes, you may proceed." Karoline adjusted the microphone. Her voice was steady, but her hands, resting on the table, were lightly clasped. The same small silver cross rested at her collarbone, glinting softly as she leaned forward. "I came to your district simply to observe a hearing," she began, "but I witnessed something I couldn't unsee, a courtroom used not for justice, but for intimidation, and a symbol of faith treated like a weapon." She paused. The silence was complete. For years, Judge Ellison has operated under a veil of procedural authority, invoking courtroom decorum to silence not only speech, but identity. That's not order. That's erasure. She laid out the data, statistics, transcripts, excerpts from audio. Then came the stories. Naomi's testimony, the young woman punished for a t-shirt, Marvin's account of buried memos, and finally, the damning statement from the judge himself: "I don't need law. I am the law." When she finished, she expected polite applause, or maybe nothing at all. Instead, a hand rose in the back row. "I'm sorry, may I?" A gray-haired man stood. He wore a maintenance uniform, his posture tense. "I was fined $1 for refusing to remove my yarmulke during jury duty 5 years ago," he said. "They said it made me look biased. I didn't know anyone else would care." Then another woman stood, and another, a soft-voiced teacher, a former city clerk, a mother whose son had been fined for disruptive attire during a traffic ticket dispute. One by one, the chamber filled with stories that had once been told only at kitchen tables, whispered and then folded away like secrets. The hearing morphed before their eyes. It was no longer a state function, it was a reckoning. When Judge Ellison was called to respond, he entered with shoulders squared, his gray suit crisp, expression composed. He didn't look at the crowd, only the panel. "I have always acted within the bounds of the law," he said. "The rules I enforce are necessary for maintaining order. Sometimes hard choices must be made to keep the peace." But order had already been shattered, not by chaos, but by truth. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "This body has reviewed the evidence. Judge Ellison, by majority vote, your judicial authority is hereby revoked indefinitely, pending a full federal review. All prior cases under your docket will be reopened for oversight." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some wept quietly, others held hands. Karoline didn't smile, she simply exhaled. When asked for final comments, she stood once more. "I came here just to watch," she said, "but once I saw what was happening, staying silent would have made me part of it. I didn't want to be part of that." The chamber broke into a low, heartfelt applause as people began to file out, hugging one another, sharing contacts, exchanging promises to testify again if needed. Karoline remained seated for a moment longer. A young man she didn't recognize slipped past the exit line. He had once worked for the court, She remembered his face from an earlier photo. He said nothing, just approached her table, placed a sealed envelope in front of her, and walked out without a word. On the front, in shaky handwriting, were 6 words. This is what he hid best. Karoline stared after him, then looked down at the envelope. The crowd was thinning, but inside her, the weight of something new was settling in. This fight wasn't over. It had just changed shape. The envelope sat on her kitchen table for hours before she opened it. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something slower, heavier, a quiet understanding that whatever was inside might not just reopen a wound, but confirm something far worse. That this fight hadn't just been against one man in a robe, but something far deeper, older, rooted. When Karoline finally slid her finger beneath the flap and unfolded the documents, her breath caught. Typed neatly in faded ink were case summaries from over a decade ago, minor cases on the surface. Petty theft, code violations, even a family custody hearing, all with judgments strangely tilted one way. Attached were notes, emails between Judge Ellison and a handful of local attorneys. Suggestions exchanged under the guise of procedural alignment. But the tone said more. Collusion dressed in legalese, strategy masked as neutrality. One line stood out: push the fine. They'll pay or disappear. Either way, we win. She leaned back in her chair, hands resting on the table's edge, letting the weight of those words settle. It had never just been about a necklace or a courtroom order. It had been about power hiding behind process. And for every story that had reached her, how many had never seen daylight? Her phone buzzed with a call from a news producer in New York. They'd seen the hearings, read the articles. The network was offering her a prime slot, host of a nationwide investigative series on the misuse of judicial discretion. She smiled, quietly. I appreciate the offer, she said, but if I'm the face, it becomes about me. This was never about me. Then what would you suggest? The producer asked. I want a platform, Karoline replied, not a stage. Build something that lets others tell their story. Survivors, witnesses, people who thought no one would believe them. Give them space. Give them light. The next afternoon, at a packed civic forum hosted in D.C., Karoline took the stage one last time, not as a press secretary or a symbol, but as a woman who once walked into a courtroom and quietly sat in the back row. The lights weren't too bright. The podium was simple. Behind her, a banner read, Voices for Justice, Stories That Were Silenced. I'm not here to be celebrated, she told the crowd. I didn't chase headlines. I followed a question, and it led me to something much bigger than a policy or a punishment. It led me to a simple truth. Systems don't protect people unless people are watching them. Constantly. She paused, scanning the room. I came here because of a small silver cross. A symbol of memory. What I didn't expect was to find how many of you were carrying something too. Stories. Scars. Silence. But not anymore. In the front row, a little girl leaned toward her mother and whispered just loud enough for a few nearby to hear. Mom, do you think I can be like her someday? A hush fell over the room. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Her mother wrapped an arm around the girl's shoulders. Yes, baby, she whispered, but only if you never stop asking why. As Karoline stepped down, applause rippled not like thunder, but like something softer. Steady, believing. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip low, casting a warm light across the marble steps. Karoline's necklace caught it just so, the cross gleaming faintly as if answering something unspoken. She reached into her pocket, her phone vibrating gently. A new email had just arrived. Subject line: a similar case is unfolding in Ohio. Are you ready to go? Karoline didn't hesitate. She tucked the phone away, took one last breath of the warm afternoon air, and began walking toward whatever came next. And maybe that's the question we all need to ask. How many small injustices are happening in plain sight, simply because no one dares to speak up? Karoline didn't plan to become a symbol, but by standing her ground over something as personal as a cross, she exposed a system far bigger than herself. What would you have done in her place? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to Shadow Secrets so you don't miss the next true story that challenges power and reveals the truth hidden in plain sight.